Siebel scholars, our program is about to begin. Please silence your cell phones and take your seats.
Hey everybody, I hope you're well caffeinated and you have your questions teed up. We've got about 45 more minutes or so, and I'm just going to first offer a little bit of feedback from kind of, hanging out with you all and roaming around the room. I think that we've started a really interesting and very broad conversation about surveillance capitalism, about the ramifications of that, about what persuasive technology is, about whether we should be using the word technology or not. I think what folks are wanting a little more of now is the human. And I'm looking at you, Sherry. I heard one interesting comment from someone saying, I wonder now whether it's okay just to come home and say happy birthday to my husband or my father if I don't post it on Facebook. Am I somehow less of a person? Am I less human? I also hear, and this is more on the practical side, well, okay, it's great to say that we can reshape the world of surveillance capitalism, but what are the laws? And I mean, we could have a whole other panel on that. There are loopholes that have been carved out for the industry to avoid legal responsibility for what it says. On the other hand, do you want surveillance capitalists, big tech, being censors or playing the role of media? This is coming to a bigger space too with IoT. We haven't even gotten into that. BJ, I know when we spoke on the phone for planning the summit, you had talked about things like voice assistants and self-driving cars and all the vehicles, almost the delivery mechanisms for everything that we've been talking about. So lots of terrain still, but let me, while folks are queuing up questions, and we'll get the mics going in a minute, Sherry, I want you to address this sort of fascinating observation. Am I less of a person if I don't post the Facebook happy birthday? And the fact that we all feel, or many of us feel that way now.
Well, the idea of I want to have a feeling, I need to make a call, I need to send a post, I need to send a text. I call it, I share, therefore I am, is how we really have started to define this new sensibility. No, you're not less of a person if you don't.
That was kind of rhetorical, but
yes.
What do you think of the psychology?
No, but I think that we have gotten into a sensibility where people really do feel that.
Yeah.
And kids grow up in a culture where the norm is that when you go out to dinner, you'll take a picture of the food.
Right.
And you'll post the meal.
Yeah.
I mean, when you're out to when you're out to dinner with friends, you'll post the meal and you'll post the Instagram and your fear of missing out. I think that famous FOMO.
Yeah.
really is a defining experience.
Yeah.
Of growing up.
Is this fundamentally different than technologies of the past? I mean, you've studied a lot of generations of technology. I know Tim Wu in his book, The Attention Merchants, did a little bit of history around that. What do you think?
Yes, it is. Because, things are a matter of scale. And when people say, I had a fascinating conversation with somebody, maybe they'll raise their hand. Well, Gutenberg, isn't this the same as, people say, well, there was always Gutenberg, and there was always, the introduction of the book, and there was always the introduction of the printing press. Yes, but sometimes a technology, by giving you an ability to share your life instantaneously and get feedback about your life instantaneously and from everybody, gives you a capacity to get effects of scale that really can change your psychology, where a new sensibility really is created. And now when people sit down to dinner and everybody has their phone, which is now, I mean, this is the work I do. I sit with American families at dinner and everybody's on their phone. That's a new, you want to say that's a new way of life. It's not, well, of course people used to bring a book sometimes to dinner, you'll say. Well, I remember, I used to go to dinner and my father would have the newspaper. Okay, But now sitting down to dinner and everybody having a phone or you go out to dinner, there are a lot of interesting studies about fast food restaurants where everybody at the fast food restaurant, child, babysitters, parents, everybody's on their phone. Mm-hmm. In other words, no adults are talking to the kids, no adults are watching the kids, no children are talking to the adults. So you're
parallel
really,
play.
everybody is in a kind of world of their own where certain kinds of intergenerational experiences really are not happening. And you're seeing this in, I think, a real crisis, and this is where I'll just end up here. I think where we're seeing this, the effects, are in a kind of crisis of empathy, where empathy is the offer. It's not, I understand you. It's, I don't understand you, and I'm going to pay attention to you.
Wow, yeah.
And I'm going to see if I can figure out what's with you. And
boy, we need to do more of that, hey?
And that is something that's fundamentally not possible. The technical possibility is not there. If you're in a playground and you're looking at your phone instead of your kid, if you're in that restaurant and you're not looking at your partner.
Yeah, you wanted to.
Yeah, let me point out a shift that I think happened in 2006. Somehow I associate it with that class. Dean Eccles was my teaching assistant. He's now at MIT as a professor. I seem to recall during that window, Facebook started shipping feed and tagging. And I may not have the exact dates right, but what happened in that class, we had a discussion about, wow, I've lost my freedom as a college student. Anything I do at a party in my dorm, everywhere, anybody can take a picture and post it and tag me. I no longer have privacy. And that felt like a huge moment, and we discussed that, and it's like, wow. And then later I followed up and I said, well, what do you do if somebody posts a picture of you drunk or doing something you don't want? He says, I don't remember how this answer came out, but what I remember is well, you just take more pictures of you and you saturate with good stuff to overwhelm the bad stuff. Now that might be common knowledge now, but back in the day that was like, one, you lost this kind of freedom as a college student. You're always going to be watched. And number two, your response to it is diluted with all the positive things.
That's an incredible observation.
Can we go?
Yeah, please.
A quick comment on this whole problem. One of the things that we have fallen prey to is a key piece of propaganda that was aimed to maximize the behavioral surplus data flows. And that is, the propaganda runs like this. If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. When the real truth is, if you have nothing to hide, then you are nothing.
That's an Eric Schmidt line, right? The if you have nothing to
Not that last one.
But the first one is
the first one is oft repeated by Eric and many others. So what we're talking about here is the creation of a different kind of social order. It's what I call the hive society. And the idea here is that we're the FOMO, and there are many categories and wrinkles and details here that I will not get into. But the idea here is that if everybody is transparent together, social comparison dynamics are tuned by, dare I say it, the surveillance capitalists. Social comparison dynamics are tuned to shift behavior and to produce behavior and to modify behavior. And this life of the hive, where everyone is visible to everyone else and everyone is confluent, flowing with these manipulated social comparison dynamics, is part of the social vision of the world that I've been describing to you. And so it's the you know, I think we're talking about the same thing at different levels of analysis, looking down the social order vision and looking up from what are the vulnerabilities within us that allow this thing to feed on us and to actually establish it.
You know, it's funny. I'm going to come to you, but let me just, if you haven't read the book, The Circle by Dave Eggers, have you guys read that book?
Yeah.
It's amazing. I mean, I think fiction sometimes can get at this stuff quite well.
In Reclaiming Conversation, where I describe my research on this, I tell a story of my grandmother. I was brought up in Brooklyn, New York, from a Eastern European background, taking me down to the mailboxes in Brooklyn when I was a little girl, 3, 4, 5, and pointing to the mailboxes and telling me, again, I'm like a baby, and of course she hadn't exactly heard of J. Edgar Hoover, so this is just my grandmother's, like, what was important to my grandmother, so. In the United States, if you send a letter, it's a federal offense to open up somebody's mail. These mailboxes are what it is to be an American.
Oh, that's so interesting.
These mailboxes are what it is to be an American. It's a federal offense to open up one of these mailboxes if it's not your mailbox. And that's why we're here.
Wow.
That's what makes me feel safe. Telling it to me. And every day she repeated it as though she'd never, you know these things sometimes grown-ups say that they keep saying? I mean, I'm sure now I say things to my daughter that, but she would, every time she said it, it was as though she had just thought of this new political theory, you know, and she was, but I mean, obviously it made such an impression on me that she put together, it's a federal offense. And her sense of safety and patriotism and civil liberties and her comfort in being a Jewish woman in America, in that little apartment in Brooklyn. And I interview hundreds, now thousands of adolescents and babies to whom this conversation about mail and opening your mail means absolutely nothing. Google reads their mail. Yeah. They're used to having their mail scraped so that they can be better targeted. I mean, opening mail. So to me, the question of can you have democracy without privacy? Can you have intimacy without privacy? Give it on this point of looking down from the top or looking up from the bottom. These have become one question. Yeah. Can you have intimacy without privacy? Can you have democracy without privacy? And I think that's where really we're talking about really the kind of sensibility and the kind of democracy we can have.
That's a really good way of encapsulating it, and it also gets at just how incredibly difficult these issues are to tease out because they're all interconnected.
Yes.
All right, let's take a few questions in the back there. And if you can please keep your questions pretty concise. We've got about 30 minutes or so. Want to get as many as possible.
Thank you. Hi, thank you very much. My name is Alex Moskowitz, a Siebel scholar from 2003 at Wharton. I've got a question, I think, for Shoshana. If you could help split the social media and other technology uses. Specifically, in my mind at least, I view social and private not going together. Social is wanting to interact with people, and therefore we should be educating our children to not have an expectation of privacy when they're on a Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, any platform that's actually intended for social use. For all the other components, do you still have the same problems with respect to selling, commoditizing human interests and behavior in ways that, frankly, the users may be unintentionally and maybe ought to have an expectation of privacy?
Well, I mean, I find it intolerable to come to the conclusion that the only way we can use the internet for social connection is to also forfeit the privacy, virtually every aspect of our experience, our relationships, the decibel level in our kitchen, our voices, our faces, all of that to this economic process that is using that to identify predictions of our behavior, to sell those predictions for profit in ways that do not advantage us, that are not for us, they're about us, they're from us, they're not to us. So, you know, in the years, after the internet sort of became public and was starting to spread, there were lots of articles out there. People were asking the question, how do you use the internet to find old friends? It was a problem that was waiting for a solution. And we should have that solution. But we should not have that solution attached to the price that we now pay to Facebook with its trillions of data points ingested every hour, training millions of models a week and creating 6 million predictions of human behavior per second, according to its own internal documents. So I would really want you to pause on that trade-off that you think you're making there. As far as the other companies, you know, the leading surveillance capitalists, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, in all of these cases, they are creating similar systems. They may seem a little less intimate because it's not the social piece, but in fact, Amazon has possibly the most predictive databases of all. Microsoft is working very hard to catch up in that domain. And Google has the largest databases, period, and the largest material infrastructure and the most data scientists. So we're talking about this economic logic that produces these huge asymmetries of knowledge and the power that accrues to that knowledge. So let me end this with one thought. We have made a mistake over these years. And that is a mistake, and with the greatest respect to you, because I love you and you're a Siebel scholar, I'm so happy that you're here this morning. But you're not alone with this. But we have made a mistake to think that privacy is something private. Privacy is not private. We think we're making a simple personal calculation. I'll get on Facebook, I'll do the thing, my children, you know, our families are connected, we'll give them this little bit of data in return for which we get this great functionality. That's not really what's happening. The little bit that you're giving them is only a fraction of what they're taking. The little bit that you're giving them, you don't even understand the predictive signals that they're drawing from it. It's not what you write, it's whether you use exclamation points, things like that. So, the thing is that privacy is not private. Every time we think we're making these personal calculations, we're contributing to a society that values certainty over freedom. Selling predictions is selling certainty. That's what their product is, selling certainty. And every time we make our experience more available to these systems, we're contributing to systems of certainty. Every society has to make a determination of where it wants to be on that spectrum between freedom and certainty. And that is the balance of power that we're contributing to when we think we're just making a simple personal calculation.
Yeah.
Quick comment?
Yeah, let me go to give a specific example to the question. I mean, you don't have to be using social. Consider maps or anything that's tracking your location. When you deviate from your normal routine, you are in a heightened state of motivation. You are deviating your routine for some reason. So if mapping or geolocation technology has mapped what you do every day, every Monday, every weekend, whatever, and suddenly you deviate, that's a flag like, what's going on with BJ? Why is he at Safeway at 3 in the morning? He usually doesn't go to Safeway at 3 in the morning. Oh, let's rewind. He was with his partner at Kaiser Permanente at the Colds Clinic. Oh, because he was there, and then that night he's now at Safeway. He's probably at Safeway to get prescription or something, right? Now, that's just for like a location technology that can then put the pieces together and make an inference. And when you deviate your normal routine, I mean, that's part of what I teach in behavior design is, you do your normal routine, a deviation from that, it's hard to do, so that means you're in a high motivation wave. And so if it's beyond the map and you look at the OS makers who know your calendar, your task, and everything else, then they have all this. Alex may disagree with me, but I think they have all these data points to make a pretty good guess about what is BJ doing at Safeway at 3 in the morning. But even if it's just simply knowing my location, that's enough to kind of signal them that something's going on. And I may be able to advertise to BJ or offer a product, or maybe as soon as I get in the car, it's like, oh, wow, you want cough medicine. We'll have it delivered in 5 minutes. Are you okay with that? And I'm like, yeah. Thinking they're helping me, but bam. Yeah, I'm like, oh, it's like magic. But guess what? They predicted what I needed, they delivered to it, but there's a real dark side to that.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, I take your point about the predictive aspect, because Google has an entire business now building out, sidewalk, building out smart cities, gathering that data. So clearly that has a lot of value, the geographic data. We have a question here, and then we'll come in the front.
Yeah, I'm Alex Icotis from Chicago Booth. I was a scholar in 2019. My question is to the panel generally. Why do you all feel, if any reasons there are, that U.S. Congress hasn't been able to act, or perhaps is very reluctant to act on this issue more generally? I think it's easy to say the economic power of these players is large, but clearly, historically, U.S. democratic institutions have acted on these big issues. We have Dodd-Frank, we have Sarbanes-Oxley, we have the EPA. What is the X factor with this issue in particular that makes it so hard for Congress to act?
I would actually like to throw in some comments to that, because I do a lot of reporting in Washington, and then whoever else would like to weigh in. I think there are several factors, and I'm with the people in DC, the senators and the aides and the regulators that think about this. I think that there has been tremendous political capture by Silicon Valley. I mean, that's just in the numbers. There's been a lot of data. I have a whole chapter in my new book, Don't Be Evil, it's called, about political lobbying on the part of Silicon Valley, and not just in terms of the sheer dollars, but, and this is a really important point, and I've been doing this 30 years, I've never seen as much subtle cognitive capture. Most academics that will, not these folks as far as I know, but that will testify about certain very technocratic issues that are contentious in a lobbying sense will be bought out by one side or the other. I mean, literally, the fine print just looks. So that's a huge issue. It's very, very difficult to find really, truly unbiased expertise, let alone reporting.
You mean bought out by the company?
Bought out by the company. Yeah. So you'll either, Google will be buying somebody, Qualcomm will be buying somebody, it depends on which side you're talking about. I found that in my own reporting that it was very, very difficult to get neutral advice. I think also, and again, I think this is quite similar to finance, there's a complexity issue. I mean, honestly, this stuff is complicated. It's very multi-layered. You're dealing, if you want to have a 360, and that's why I asked Shoshana to start, you want to pull way, way back. But when you think about how laws are being crafted, I mean, the amount of horse trading, the amount of siloing, it doesn't lend itself. And that's why actually, Shoshana, as much as I would like to think that you're right, that we can somehow take this back, I study the laws, and I don't know which law or even which series of laws at this point would do that. So I'm just going to say my piece, but then please jump in.
Also, I just want to say I think that it's taken a very long time for the original, I think Shoshana described it very well, and you paraphrase it in your title, do no evil, think big, we're the good guys, we're creating the future, this friction-free future, this it's taken a very long time for the generation of lawmakers who are the generation of people who built this, who are to not feel that this was kind of America's contribution to the good. I think that sense that this, that let's really look at this, not just because money was being applied in vast amounts, but what you're calling cognitive capture was a cognitive and emotional capture in the sense of people identifying with this technology as our American contribution to this century. This was what we had contributed to the world.
Teflon industry, absolutely. And you know, this line is a lobbying line right now, because when we're in the sort of US-China geopolitics, tech and trade, that line is being played again and again. I'm in a funny, I'm just in a funny world. You know, I went to Harvard and I taught at MIT, and between those two kind of places, each of which thinks it's the best, you know, I mean, I went to the University of Chicago too. You know, the identification with this technology, with this thing as our American thing, and that now we have to look and see what our contribution, you know, but so was the other evils of capitalism, our American thing. I mean, but I think, and watching that Mark Zuckerberg, I mean, I think that the Mark Zuckerberg testimony to Congress is— You mean the 4-hour tech support call?
Yes, the original 4-hour, whatever you want to call that. That is a document that needs to be taught in every history, sociology, computer science. I mean, that needs to be a foundational text for what was wrong with that testimony.
Yeah.
Because the answer to your question of what are the roadblocks, what are the I mean, that no one, you know, the congressman not knowing what to ask, his having no desire to answer, basically nothing getting done, thank God it's over, snap, 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 out, and it's a, no, I think there can be changes, and I think there will be changes, because we've had moments, I'm optimistic now about climate change in a way that I wasn't before.
Shoshana, go ahead.
Who asked the question? What's your name again? Alex? Alex, okay. So you had a very cool word that you used there. What's the X factor, right? You said, what's the X factor? I agree with everything that's been said, but I think there is an X factor that doesn't get talked about. And I call this surveillance exceptionalism. And so the story here is that I mentioned to you before that the FTC had concluded early on that the tech sector was not going to be able to self-regulate. In the 2000-2001, they developed these proposals for comprehensive federal privacy legislation, the FTC commissioners. On September 10th, 2001, these proposals were circulating in the Congress. And the whole discussion in the Congress when it came to the fledgling internet companies was a discussion about privacy. On September 11th, 2001, that discussion changed 180 degrees. And according to people who were there at the time and involved in this, they describe it as a radical shift from a discussion about privacy to a discussion about total information awareness. And at that point, something changed in our history. Again, this is history, not technology, right? So what changed was now you've got these fledgling companies. They're not the big surveillance capitalists at this point, right? They're still the little Googles and a bunch of other little internet companies. But there was a recognition that for the very same reasons that we wanted to regulate them for privacy, there was a recognition that they were developing surveillance capabilities, knowledge gathering capabilities, information gathering capabilities, analytic capabilities, that many of these capabilities were going to be very difficult to sustain within public agencies, that sooner or later would come under the scrutiny of law, that for these capabilities to develop in the market sphere, in the private sector, had the advantage of being protected from constitutional oversight. And so what was created at that point was what Max Weber called elective affinities. The idea that there are, it's not just as simple as mutual interest, but the idea that these two major institutional forces sort of having overlapping, shared sense of what was needed for the future. And there is a great deal of evidence to suggest that from that time, and for quite a long time, there was a lack of interest in regulating, a lack of interest in law, a lack of interest in doing anything from Washington that would impede the growth of these capabilities and keep them harbored, in the safe harbor of the private sector. And one can find, for example, 2007, NSA, the folks at NSA developed this really enthusiastic, cool document that's all about how do we become more like Google, right? So it's protecting these capabilities, it's emulating these capabilities, it's integrating these capabilities, and I think that goes a certain distance toward explaining why they have been able to root and flourish as effectively as they have.
I want to jump in and I want to ask you to follow up on that and the panel as well before we move on. We've sort of danced around this, but there is explicitly a big debate amongst various sort of interest groups right now about how the US should respond to China. And big tech is a very big part of this debate. There is one school of thought that says you got to be big to fight China. I mean, there's a book by Kai-Fu Lee, AI Superpowers it's called. He's the guy who started Google in China, and he's now a venture capitalist. And he's arguing that you got to have all the data, otherwise you can't win against China. A lot of companies, Google, Amazon, et cetera, Amazon's actually trying to ring-fence government procurement right now, use that bigger argument. I hear from a lot of investors, I personally believe myself that we would do better with a decentralized model, which is, I don't think you can beat China at a centralized model. I think you want decentralized, and you want to let a lot of innovation flourish. But that debate has become incredibly political and plays into...
And it's only just started.
And it's only just started. So jump in if anyone wants to help flesh that out.
Well, I mean, I won't take up all the airtime, but just to say that in my view, this is a new drum roll that wants to play the role for the next decade, what the war on terror and total information awareness played for the last couple of decades.
So building on what you just talked about.
A way of reinvigorating surveillance exceptionalism and keeping these surveillance capitalism protected for another round. And of course, the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence is chaired by Eric Schmidt.
Yes, exactly. Say no more. Let's move on. Question over here.
I'll try to make an assertion you can bat around. So we've talked about sucking up data and using it to influence people as a problem. We've talked about the product itself kind of changing social dynamics and having negative effects as a problem. We haven't talked at all about the way this social media changes the media distribution system. And so the assertion I'd make is the change in the media distribution system seems to me to be a massive problem with benefits but harms that are way bigger than the benefits. The technology changing social interaction, affecting self-esteem, we'll talk about this afternoon, major problem. The sucking up of data to persuade people, I've heard a lot of normative judgments about why we don't like it, not a lot of specific examples of why it's bad. So just in the interest of framing, like, what are the bigger problems to tackle, I would suggest that the media distribution and the products itself are pretty damaging. The data itself has pros and cons, but nowhere near the same league of problem as the other.
And let me ask you a question before you give up the mic. When you say the distribution, you're talking about the fact that the shift in business model puts people into cognitive silos, or?
I think that the news that people are presented with is now very framed and selective. So they're getting, it's not just the silos. I would throw in the fact that Twitter, which is completely non-representative of the population, is driving the news agenda, which is mostly driven by journalists themselves. So I'd throw that in there as well on the media side.
Okay. Anybody want to grab?
Josh Bennett, Kellogg 2000.
Yeah, I'll take a weird twist on it.
Sure.
A weird twist. I agree with you, absolutely. One of my major concerns about what's going on is the effect on climate. And I think the big tech companies we're talking about, and others, are promoting consumption. And so in my newsfeed, I read like, oh, 12 tech products you really need to be a productive person. That's in my news. I click through, oh, I need this, click, order from Amazon, another huge box, and all this packaging arrives for a tiny little thing. And so I'm seeing a connection, and I worry a lot about that we're being motivated, prompted, and conditioned to buy all these things, which is putting added burden on the planet. And that's not coming from my scientific research, and I don't know how much of a burden that is, but that just seems like absolutely the wrong direction, but it's showing up in my news.
I would add, actually, I'll just throw in, since I'm a journalist and live this every day, decimation of the business model, big problem for us, big problem for society in general. Lots of studies to show that when more people get their news from social media, that trust in liberal democracy goes down, so that's part of this. But one thing, it's fascinating, one of the reasons I chose to work for a British financial publication is because we are less, it's less bifurcated than a lot of the media here. I hear from friends, even at really high-end publications like The New Yorker, that you can't get on the homepage unless you've got a particular kind of headline about the president. We are now, even at the FT and frankly at every publication, we are now surveyed in terms of a variety of metrics. How many hits you get, how social your newsletter is, the quality of journalism. I don't even look at the metrics. I've fortunately reached a level in my career that I don't have to worry about it anymore. Not so much for the rest of the journalists, which is already having an effect on the kind of stories that get written.
Also, there's study after study that shows that, I mean, to this gentleman's point, that that on something like YouTube, you're 5 clicks away from some crazy story on the left or on the right about some, pornographic thing about Donald Trump or some pornographic thing about Hillary Clinton. No matter where you started, you could have started off looking for a Ford Taurus. And,
oh my God, we're back to Ford.
No, I'm sorry. A Lexus, you could have, you start out looking for a car, and somehow, really, no matter what your age or stage,
you're getting something you don't want.
It's something you don't want, but it's always something political and out there.
Yeah.
Because people, they're leading you towards things that someone's made, where it's been decided that people want to see it. So it's
Let's get a couple more questions in. One up front here. Oops.
Oh, yeah. I really wanted your take on anonymizing data, and I want to frame it by saying it's not a perfect technology because there are ways to de-anonymize data, but also, I think that it's also misleading when companies say that we'll anonymize your data for you in return for using it, because they're also using it for personal targeting. So even though I don't know anything about BJ specifically, I can say at scale, because as Shoshana said, it's only a fraction of what I have at scale, I can say things about BJ's commute or BJ's behavior. And so I believe discrimination law prevents the use of protected classes, but companies kind of sidestep that by saying, okay, we anonymize all this information so we don't know race, gender, sexual orientation explicitly. And it's also really hard to prove disparate impact too, as in terms of in court. And so what is your take on anonymization? What do you think of it as a tool that technologies use? And do you think that perhaps innovations in anonymizing data are sort of irrelevant given sort of the consequences of using the data in the first place?
Well,
BJ,
I'll
do you wanna
bite
start?
on the innovation question. So I'm always thinking about specific behavior, specific solutions. And one thing I've been toying with is something that I call fair data. So just like fair trade or fair harvest, where you say, here's where the source is. What if, and I've talked to 2 influential people at Firefox, I'm not going to pursue it myself, so I'm throwing it out there if some of you want. What if, when you're interacting through a web browser, perhaps Firefox, there's a button where you can click and it says, tell me where you got my data. So what's the data provenance? Did you get it fairly? And that's all it tells you. It doesn't tell you what it is. So an innovation might be, and I'm sure it would be quite easy to run the study to show that perhaps certain types of people would switch to a browsing experience where they could reveal the data versus one who conceals it. So something like that. I'm sure there's a bunch. I mean, this could be a topic. So I have the flexibility at Stanford to run classes on pretty much anything I want, and I pick what I think are the most important topics. So that could be an idea that could have fallen out of the class, something like that. But I do think the younger generation, like where did this diamond come from? Where did the coffee beans come from? Where did my data come from? So you're serving me this ad, or you've invited me to sign up for this. So it's the fair data and data provenance might be a new way of helping people understand your data came from somewhere, and there's a reason they showed you this, or there's a reason you're at this page at this point, and the data can help you understand that.
Shoshana, do you want to jump in before we move to the next question?
Well, I mean, I agree with you. There's a lot of levels to this. Some of that anonymization is purely rhetorical. Some of it is, as we know, that data can be de-anonymized. But, in general, you've got these huge data flows that are being used to train models, and the models create these big profiles, and in parallel, they're working back to the individual to understand where the individual fits in this profile, and that is what allows the model to not only predict a group, but to be used to come back and predict an individual's behavior. So you may be aware of that leaked Facebook memo, another leaked Facebook memo. We depend so much on leaks and,
Right.
and whistleblowers,
Yeah.
which is, again, why it's called surveillance capitalism. But this one was leaked in 2018, but it was written in 2017 by Australian Facebook executives.
Oh, yeah.
Written to its Australian and New Zealand business customers. And long story short, it said, we have so much data on 6.6 million young adults and teenagers in your 2 countries. We now can map their emotional cycles throughout the week. We know their ups and downs emotionally each day and what the patterns are across the week. And we can see it in the group, but we can tailor it back to an individual. So what's your name? Ji Young. So we can see when Ji Young she's heading into Thursday evening, maximum social anxiety because she's really uptight about the date that she's got Friday night. And if you can send her a confidence-boosting message tonight and offer a discount on a sexy black leather jacket and tell her it's going to be delivered, right at her door tomorrow morning for free, maximum probability of success. So here we have the group, we have the ability to tune it down to the individual, and we have the ability to share that information with the business customer who's going to come in to trigger, to exploit your emotional state in exactly the way that Cambridge Analytica endeavored to do, right? So bottom line is anonymity should not, make you feel cozy and warm at night when you don't have to go to sleep.
Let's take one final question. Who will be the lucky questioner? Let's see. I think we should go on this side, maybe in the back somewhere.
Like volunteer.
Hi, I am Sumegha from Princeton University. So I was wondering, my question is for Sherry. You said you will draw a line at the empathy apps. So my question is, one of the aims
what
of
apps?
The empathy apps.
app. So my question is, one of the aims of technology is to make life easier for us. So how do we start defining what areas we are not supposed to let it be, make our life easier in?
Well, because it's a great question. So the question is, what's easy and what's easy disguising as diminishing? And I'm saying that you can do some things that have a feel-good feeling that actually are diminishing of your potential as a human. So giving, what is your name?
Sumegha.
Samina. Giving a child, as there are now, potty trainers and baby bouncers with a slot for an iPhone where the child is always stimulated, never has a moment for solitude, never has a moment for boredom, is a feel-good thing. But it diminishes over time that child's capacity to develop the capacity for boredom, which we know is very important developmentally, and the capacity for solitude, which is so important for relationships. There's a great quote in the psychological literature, which is if you don't teach your child to be alone, they'll only know how to be lonely. That you need the capacity for solitude in order to be able to then reach out to another person and form a real relationship with them. So that you need the capacity to feel at one with yourself and okay alone, to know yourself in order to then really meet another person and be empathic and form a relationship with them. So in figuring out what makes us feel good, we have to keep our eye on the bigger game of what will make us really develop ourselves as human beings, not just what will stimulate us kind of in the moment. So a kind of slot machine mentality of give me a moment of excitement, pleasure, a food pellet with my phone, or with some kind of technological device is a different orientation from saying, hey, we have this technology, what are the things we can do with it that will really develop us, and watch out for the things we might be doing with it that will inhibit rather than develop our human capacities that we rely on for what I think is the big game, which is to develop empathic relationships with other people.
I think that that is a perfect place to end this panel because I'm not even going to try, by the way. You know, at the end of these things, you're always supposed to, if you're the moderator, kind of wrap it up in a tidy bow. Not going to do that. It's big, it's deep, it's fast, it's the question of our age. You guys have been great. Thank you so much for sharing all your expertise.